but is it useful? Poetry in a changing world. Fiona is Professor of Poetry at Roehampton University. She's a widely published poet herself, and Fiona is also Poetry Editor of New Humanist, which you've been doing for about 3 years now.
Yes. I'm going to talk, but it will be for about half an hour, then I'll read some poems. But when I talk, I'm reading poems too, they're just not by me. In fact, I'm going to start with a poem. This is one I like enormously. It's by Bill Merwin, W.S. Merwin, who's now, I think, about 90, still alive, great American poet. And it's called Vixen. Comet of stillness, princess of what is over, high note held without trembling, without voice, without sound, aura of complete darkness, keeper of the kept secrets of the destroyed stories, the escaped dreams, the sentences never caught in words, warden of where the river went, touch of its surface, symbol of the inextinguished window onto the hidden place, and the other time at the foot of the wall by the road, patient, without waiting, in the full moonlight of autumn, at the hour when I was born, you no longer go out like a flame at the sight of me. You are still warmer than the moonlight gleaming on you. Even now you are unharmed. You are perfect as you have always been. Now when your light paws are running on the breathless night, on the bridge with one end, I remember you when I have heard you. The soles of my feet have made answer. When I have seen you, I have waked and slipped from the calendars, from the creeds of difference and the contradictions that were my life, and all the crumbling fabrications, as long as it lasted, until something that we were had ended. When you are no longer anything, let me catch sight of you again, going over the wall. And before the garden is extinct and the woods are figures guttering on a screen, let my words find their own place in the silence after the animals. This is the title poem of the Vixen, which Merwin published in 1996 when he was nearly 70 and had lived in the Lot region of France for many years. It's a poem that uses both mythological, quasi-religious language and declares itself against creeds. It calls them creeds of difference. It's a poem whose music is very precisely scored by the line breaks, by the way it's all one sentence. But it's also a poem to wander around in, having impressions and being reminded of things, and feeling that most inarticulable of things, an atmosphere. It's a shifty thing, full of both depth and shallows. In short, it's many of the things that I look for in a poem. And here is a less paradoxical poem that's as well known over here as Merwin's is in North America. Like Merwin, its author served as poet laureate. Ted Hughes's The Thought Fox is a famous early poem which admits it is about one single thing, the writing of poetry. The Thought Fox. I imagined this midnight moment's forest. Something else is alive beside the clock's loneliness and this blank page where my fingers move. Through the window I see no star. Something more near, though deeper within darkness, is entering the loneliness. Cold, delicately as the dark snow, a fox's nose touches twig, leaf. Two eyes serve a moment, that now and again, now and now and now, set neat prints into the snow between trees, and warily a lame shadow lags by stump and in hollow of a body that is bold to come across clearings, an eye, a widening, deepening greenness, brilliantly concentratedly coming about its own business, till, with a sudden sharp hot stink of fox, it enters the dark hole of the head. The window is starless still, the clock ticks, the page is printed. And one of the things that shows us is there's no right way to write about a fox, or indeed anything in poetry. Do you think it's possible to shut one of those doors so that we don't have the whole of Radio 4? Gosh, it's still quite loud, isn't it? It's come through the wall, isn't it?
Yeah.
No.
It's not really a wall.
No, it's wood panel, isn't it? Oh, and there's a door. Oh, well, there. So Ted Hughes's poem is in full rhyme, and its short lines, its short 4-line stanzas, make it feel single-pointed, as tough as a balled fist as it comes about its own business. But it too contains many ambiguities. What is it actually telling us? Is poetry writing then a happy process? Is it voluntary or is it involuntary? The poem very precisely creates an image of the fox, but it doesn't tell us what this image means. It's a symbol, and now it's been evoked, it's ours to play with. Since symbols, ambiguity, and indeed the natural world all make us think for ourselves about what's non-immediate and yet in our world, the stock response to poems like these is that they teach us what it is to be human. In our house, we make a running joke of spotting this cliché. It's everywhere, in reviews of, introductions to, even critical work on poetry. I have an American friend, the short story writer Leslie Becker, who says the same thing about chickens. She says that in every film there's a chicken, alive or dead. My husband is always daring me to use this phrase when I'm doing a presentation about poetry, and you see I've managed it here already. The trouble is that, like most clichés, poetry teaches us what it means to be human does contain an element of truth. Like maths or political theory, poetry is a form of thought, and so it is a way in which human understanding goes on. Do you want to go out? He's not allowed. Is he not allowed? Oh! Even though he lives here. That's good, right. Since it is a way in which human understanding goes on, we might expect good poetry to understand more, or more deeply, than bad verse does, as researcher mathematicians discover what high school students can't. Sure enough, we find William McGonagall's odes implausible and hilarious, but read Shakespeare's sonnets for insights into lovers' behaviour. And I can't resist, partly because there are some Russians here tonight who might not know about William McGonagall, reading the opening of The Tay Bridge Disaster. Do you want to go out there? Come on, let's go out. Let's go, come on, come this way. Or otherwise, all evening, you're going to be fretting, aren't you? That's such a great thing when it's not your own dog and it's somebody else's dog. So here's the Tay Bridge Disaster. This is just the first stanza, it's a long poem. Beautiful railway bridge of the silvery Tay. Alas, I am very sorry to say that 90 lives have been taken away on the last Sabbath day of 1879, which will be remembered for a very long time. Actually, I have to say, I like the slant rhyme of 9 and time. That's not bad, is it? But then on the other hand, you have, inevitably I have to read a Shakespeare example, something like Sonnet 143, which is on my mind at the moment because the Arden Shakespeare just commissioned a whole number of contemporary poets to write a sonnet or write a poem in response to Shakespeare's sonnets because of the anniversary. And I chose number 143 because I thought it's a very human quandary that it illustrates. So I think that the acuity of his emotional intelligence sort of remains with us. Lo, as a careful housewife runs to catch one of her feathered creatures broke away, sets down her babe, and makes all swift dispatch in pursuit of the thing she would have stay, whilst her neglected child holds her in chase, cries to catch her whose busy care is bent to follow that which flies before her face. not prizing her poor infant's discontent. So run'st thou after that which flies from thee, whilst I, thy babe, chase thee afar behind. But if thou catch thy hope, turn back to me, and play the mother's part. Kiss me, be kind. So will I pray that thou mayst have thy will, if thou turn back on my loud crying still. He's so sly, isn't he? But there is more to poetry than wise thinking in full rhyme. The work it does is altogether more sui generis. We recognise this intuitively too, not least when we use the term poetic to mean something unusual or aesthetic, or that isn't straightforward, or that evokes complex emotions. And it is this special way of going on that makes poetry an essential part of a rationalist worldview, though I suspect it does much of its work unnoticed. Let me try to explain. Like it or not, we live after the death of God. Many of our ways of thinking about experience, embodiment and society, while they satisfy rationalist criteria, were hammered out in a world that was still poised between heaven and hell. We're a little like the anonymous Anglo-Saxon poet of The Wanderer, living among the remains of Roman civilization, those ancient works of giants standing unused. Kantian ethics are one good example of such carried-over thinking. Immanuel Kant's 1788 Critique of Practical Reason has an enticingly rationalist title. His model of ethics, based on recognising the other person as another self, as being an end in him or herself, in the same way as oneself, cuts through those insidious Aristotelian some are more equal than others distinctions, the citizen above the slave, the man above his wife. We feel comfortable basing our desire for anti-discriminatory fair dealing on its picture of recognition and equivalency. But that's the thing, we feel comfortable. There's nothing unfamiliar or even what Sigmund Freud calls unheimlich, unhomely, about the idea, because it isn't new, it's where we are with things. We've inherited it from what we might call the metaphysical era. Kant's own proof of his principle is tortuous, to say the least. Or think of René Descartes compromising the absolute rationalism of his cogito to make it serve also as a proof of the existence of God. To remember this isn't to discount the practical insights either offers. I call myself a Kantian when it comes to ethics, though not, I hope, when it comes to prosody. Instead, it is to accept living with uncertainty and proceeding with contingency. Sometimes we do things just because we've agreed that they're a good idea, not because we know they are true. This requires us to keep our nerve. In John Keats' famous formulation, in a December 1817 letter to his brothers Tom and George, the poet's special talent is famously negative capability. That is, when a man is capable of being in uncertainties, mysteries, doubts, without any irritable reaching after fact and reason. Turns out that, far from being the daydreamer of soft-focused biopics, what Keats is actually doing here is offering us a technique. He's talking about the poem-writing mind as one able to contain ambiguity, but the capacity to do so is much wider in application. For instance, there's real human pathos in reading this letter, written within 3 years of his death by someone already living with the radical ambiguity, the will I, won't I, and when of life-threatening illness. Keats's immediate family were already dying from tuberculosis. His clinical training meant that he knew what this might mean for him too. This ambiguity is brilliantly at work in Keats's own late great ode of 1819. Ode to a Nightingale plays on the brink of both ecstasy and death. From its famous opening, my heart aches and a drowsy numbness pains my sense as though of hemlock I have drunk, through the equally famous darkling I listen, and for many a time I have been half in love with easeful death, to end not in resolution, with a question. Was it a vision? or a waking dream? Fled is that music. Do I wake or sleep? Life and death, pleasure and suffering are being contained here simultaneously. The poem is like a piece of music that wavers between major and minor keys. It's a balancing act that is tremendously hard to achieve, something like laughing through tears or being on the very brink of sensation. Yet this poem does it for us. In other words, the poetry allows us to experience more than one thing in more than one way simultaneously. While this is the case, so also is that. In Walt Whitman's blunter, transatlantic formulation of this potential for poetry to be what Freud again called polymorphously perverse, do I contradict myself? Very well then, I contradict myself. I am large. I contain multitudes. This is from part 51, near the end of Song of Myself, and let's not forget the equally well-known fourth and fifth lines of this book-length poem. I loaf and invite my soul. I lean and loaf at my ease, observing a spear of summer grass. Our games teacher used to yell, "Let it come to you," when we struggled to catch a ball. And completely fallacious. I mean, if the ball is over there, you have to go immediately. But the same principle of let it come to you is at play here, as in Keats's refusal to reach irritably after definitions. Song of Myself, with its loafing and lying at ease, was composed less than 40 years later than Keats's Ode, but in a radically different personal and cultural place and moment. Whitman was young too when he first wrote it, but he had a long, controversial and high-profile life ahead of him in the rapidly expanding New World of 19th century American society. And ambiguity isn't just the private obsession of particular poets. The 20th century literary critic William Empson founded the highly influential Anglo-American school of New Criticism on his theory that writing explores conflicts of understanding through 7 types of ambiguity, as the title of his well-known 1930 study indicates. For the record, those 7 types are 1. Metaphor, 2. Multiple metaphors or meanings used simultaneously to mean one thing, 3. One word with 2 appropriate meanings in that context, 4. Multiple meanings that remain multiple. It's a bit of an accountant, isn't it? 5. Finding the idea only in the process of writing, which is rather postmodern. 6. Not stating, but forcing the reader to create a statement. And 7. Contradiction in terms. Mm-hmm. Not terribly ambiguous, that list, actually. Yeah. It's rather sort of, yes, conscientious. Meanwhile, though, it's a truism of mental health care that containing the multitudes of ambiguity is a sign of health. Donald Winnicott, the paediatric psychoanalyst who emerged as a leading figure in the middle group of British 20th century psychoanalysis, argues within the influential Playing and Reality of 1971 that potential space, which is created by children in play and by adults through the arts, is where we practice this containing ambiguity. We do so not least by developing empathy. I am not X, but I'm allowed to try on being X. First by dressing up and playing house, later by reading or watching films or theatre. And this gives me a sense of connectedness to, as well as a better understanding of, X. Winnicott contrasts this playful, democratic approach with immature, authoritarian personalities. Today, the single point of refusal of ambiguity that characterises religious and other types of fundamentalism highlights pressingly just how key an understanding of the coexistence of multiple possibilities is to a well-functioning society. So the violence with which Trump supporters jostle dissidents is the same immature gesture as the attempt by any religion to have its rules trump, so to speak, local and national legislation, even from non-believers, and that of football fans beating up foreigners in the street. This also highlights how difficult it is to surrender certainty. Allowing ambiguity to exist means accepting, for example, that I'm not always right, that there are limits to what I can know, that more than one thing may be going on simultaneously, and that there can be kinds of meaning which are entirely local or individual rather than universalizable. The American poet C.K. Williams, himself a sometime therapist and a master of the Whitmanesque all-containing long line, writes in the tract both that it is, quotes, absurd writing a word, striking it out, while all around you, as the books of truth say, is suffering and suffering, and about hanging on to the hope that someday I'll accept without qualm or question that the reality of others, the love of others, the miracle of others, all that which feels like enough is truly enough. No celestial sea, no God in his bark of being, just life, just hanging on for dear life. By the way, if you look up Charlie's TED Talk online, you'll see their copywriter has done a teaches us what it is to be human on him. Their formula is, he reminds us of the unique challenges of living. I mean, also, isn't there a tautology in there somewhere? John Keats, of course, was a romantic, one of the second English generation of that movement's poets, which also included Lord Byron and Percy Bysshe Shelley. At our distance, their exploration of the self as a locus of experience can seem self-indulgent. But it is a major British contribution to a movement that originated among Kant's contemporaries in German philosophical idealism and arrived in the 1880s at Nietzsche's declaration that God is dead. At the time, it had the creative force of an idea that was new and needed to be learnt and lived in, to be bedded down the way a dog turns a new blanket into a bed, tugging and flattening it into shape. It's true that the Romantics have dominated the British reception of poetry for too long. They seem to be the patrons of every amateur diarist and New Age counsel who believes in expressing yourself through poetry. If you've taught as much creative writing as I have, you likely have a knee-jerk resistance to this whole idea. But their exploration of emotion and its communicability was a key part of a shift from the sense of an essentially passive self, subject to divine law, to taking individual responsibility for understanding and agency. Caspar David Friedrich's famous 1817-18 portrait of the wanderer above the mists, fashionably dressed but standing alone above the cloud line on an alpine crag, is echt Romanticism. It's the self as transcendent subject, but it's also a portrait of a tail-coated human individual, replacing the omniscient mosaic god on the mountaintop. From now on, this is who will be making meaning. Poetry, then, is deeply involved in the understanding of and the celebration of ambiguity. But surely this is at least potentially true of all forms of literature, even of speech, that aren't reportage, memoir, fiction, joke, or gossip. All leave room for us to select from among numerous potential motivations for their protagonists. None do that more schematically, after all, in detective fiction, where the text is a puzzle for the reader to resolve before the detective does so in the last reveal. That's true, but poetic ambiguity is more thoroughgoing than this. After all, one of the things we know about the poetic genre is that it doesn't have to be faithful to something in the real world. It's not necessarily confessional. It doesn't even have to be true to a story it's telling. We know it sometimes seems to be about just its sound, for example. There's a kind of semantic instability built into its every word that is hard for some readers to bear and enormously seductive to others. And this is both produced and contained by an equally thoroughgoing semiotic identity. In other words, what helps us bear the radical openness of poetry's meanings is the patterning, usually of sounds, that it offers us at the same time. A good example of this is in song from oral tradition, which has lost some of its connections over the centuries and so doesn't necessarily make perfect sense, yet retains a strong character. In the lightweight dirge, for example, we know roughly what the song is praying for, but even when we know that fleet means the house floor, a metonym for the house room, we still don't quite know how, quotes, this I night, every night and all, fire and fleet and candlelight, and Christ receive thy soul. But the rhyme draws all these elements together in a connection as strong as if it were grammatical. To put it yet another way, poetry shows us that the world is crazier and more of it than we think. Incorrigibly plural, as Louis MacNeice says in Snow. But it also allows us the consolations of a formal pattern that means nothing beyond itself. The form of a rhyming couplet can allude to its hundreds upon hundreds of predecessors. It can imply the poet's technical training. It can even mime the coupling of lovers, as when they get together at the end of a sonnet or a sestina. But it does not itself mean anything. So poems allow us to rehearse the possibility that pattern is something we recognise or employ only for its own sake, because it reassures us or gives us pleasure. In other words, something like beauty. Keats' much quoted ending to another of his 1819 odes, Ode on a Grecian Urn, "Beauty is truth, truth beauty, that is all ye know on earth and all ye need to know," now falls into place. Keats isn't saying that we can recognise truth because it's beautiful. It frequently is not, as war, disease and famine, not to mention the quotidian chaos of human motivation, for example, demonstration. But rather the opposite. Beauty is true only to itself. It is an end in itself. Better still, or worse, depending on your point of view, we can't be sure of anything more than the fearful symmetry of beauty itself. Beauty does not imply an immortal hand or eye, without which the world's fearful symmetry could not exist. The poem from which those familiar phrases come, William Blake's The Tiger, has a lovely Cockney rhyme at the end of its first verse. "Tiger, tiger, burning bright, in the forest of the night, what immortal hand or eye could frame thy fearful symmetry?" Or if it hasn't got a Cockney accent, it's slant, which is to say, slightly off. Such a slant in poetic form plays with strict formal pattern, and in doing so embellishes it. The ear oscillates between tree and try. So symmetry or symmetry, hand or eye, symmetry. Uncertainties, mysteries and doubts are part of the sound of poetry too. Another example of the way poetry plays with the ear's uncertainty is that bonus metrical foot in the Alexandrian line, which has a sixth foot in what is otherwise iambic pentameter, that strict di-dum, 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 di-dum. An Alexandrian sort of has a hop at the end, usually at the end of a stanza. Meaning can also be slanted, of course. Tell all the truth, but tell it slant. The American poet Emily Dickinson instructed herself sometime in the mid-19th century in a poem, number 1263, which is now famous for the advice it gives tyro writers. Tell all the truth, but tell it slant. Success in circuit lies. Too bright for our infirm delight, the truth's superb surprise. As lightning to the children eased with explanation kind, the truth must dazzle gradually, or every man be blind. Dickinson's truth is metaphysical, but her insight, that it would be oxymoronic for such a truth to be susceptible to handling by the local human self, is applicable to the most rationalist of contexts. We know that there are known unknowns, as Donald Rumsfeld had it, that no one individual can know the sum of the countless facts about the universe and beyond. We must proceed gradually, by way of doubts, uncertainties, metaphors, hints and ambiguity, as poetry shows us. The truth must dazzle gradually, or every man be blind. It's hard to do so. Thought and imagination are, after all, forms of impatience that want to work on and to change the given. The poet has to unlearn willfulness and to learn patience instead, not to define, but to pay attention, to know that he or she often does not know. The wider relevance of this Keatsian technique in a world of uncertainties, of rapidly and potentially catastrophic ecological political and religious change should not need spelling out. We need to pay radical attention, not to attempt to preempt our uncertainties, but to go through the uncomfortable business of waiting upon multiple possibilities that may be the case, if we're not to make what's already dangerous disastrous. To be uncertain turns out to be the most rational thing we can do. Mm-hmm. Yes. Well, I would like to read a few poems, but I mean, do we want to have a sort of pause for questions or anything? Or,
yeah.
Or are you? Could you bear some poems straight away? Because I know once you get to the wine, I'll have lost you.
Does anybody have questions or comments at this point?
Great.
I have a friend who used to be a professor of logic and now writes various sorts of non-fiction. We were talking about fiction and poetry, and he said people like him have a complete inability to really appreciate poetry because they can't think outside of certainties. And you talk lots about ambiguity, and do you think someone like that can be taught if they tried?
Absolutely.
To write poetry?
Yes. I mean, we're all human, aren't we? I mean, and poetry isn't difficult. It just requires a kind of act of going to meet, a kind of trust, I think. I used to work a lot with community groups, and I was thinking about this a lot this week because last night there was a Welcome Trust lecture I was giving about poetry and health, because I used to work in poetry and health and a lot. And I worked a lot with people who had no background in any of the arts at all, no prior experience, let alone engagement really. And, you know, people really with no education at all get the most sophisticated poetry kind of instantly, particularly actually in times of extremis when they have no defences. Because it isn't an intellect, it's not a puzzle, it's something you relax into. And I used to say in those groups, doesn't matter if you don't get everything in the first time through or the second time, just have the experience. Because actually, how thin the poetic text would be if you got it all the first time with nothing more to get. And I think giving oneself, and I still find that too, I mean there are lots of poems that I read, and I think everyone always needs a poem more than once, and I think there's no shame in drifting in and out of concentrating on a poem, leave alone in and out of following it. I think the poem is a sound as well as a semantic world, and it takes you somewhere, but like listening to music, you're not always, as it were, playing every note with it, and that's fine. That's obviously the other end from an academic logician, but it's the same principle. It's just about allowing yourself to relax into it. It's, as my games teacher would say, let it come to you. Okay.
I have a question, please. Of course, we can all agree that our search for certainty is intellectual vice in a way. And poetry helps to overcome that or battle with this. But is it useful in any other way, really?
Yes, I think it's very useful. I mean, I also had a problem writing last night's lecture and writing this because I wanted to divide up the things I said and not repeat myself. But I did spend 12 years working with poetry in healthcare, and I kind of tested poetry to destruction there. In fact, so did the people in the groups. And some of the many things that we learnt was that poetry. One of the things that Poetic Ambiguity does is it offers you a kind of alibi and a kind of mask, a kind of privacy, so that you can see, if you're reading a poem, or express and explore, if you're writing the poem, as little or as much of something as you're comfortable with. You can indeed approach, difficult truths head on. For example, if, someone dear to you has a difficult diagnosis, or you do yourself, there are lots and lots of things that you think that you don't quite want to think. Thoughts that you don't want to follow through to the end yet, or sometimes you do, because there's no one in your life with whom you can have those conversations, because people who are close to you, you're protecting them, and there are all sorts of reasons why poetry offers a kind of capaciousness, because it tells itself with clarity, but it doesn't have to tell something beyond itself with clarity. So, for example, a poem that I used to use a lot in hospice is a poem by Edward Thomas called Lights Out, and it starts, I've come to the borders of sleep, so I've more deep forest where all must lose their way, so, soon or late. And it says, here ambition dies, everything falls away, and you know, I can't resist, I'm falling asleep. It's a poem about sleep, but it's also, of course, a poem about death, and so someone can hear that or not as they're comfortable. And there aren't that many. Usually we force people to choose, so it's not only about ourselves as voters and this, but in more difficult situations. I also think that poetry is a mnemonic. So, you know, like in demonstrations, you get something into a rhyme and you chant it, and there it is, it's, you know, it's fixed, and it's a good way to pass messages to and fro in a society, sometimes a society where speech is not direct, it offers a code. There are lots and lots of things that poetry does without somehow stopping being poetry. I mean, that's different from when it's used as, for example, advertising for, you know, I don't know, coffee, or I can't think what it'd be used for, but, you know, the equivalent of music, you know, yeah. I think it's a very useful discourse.
I have a couple of silly questions. First silly question is how to decide, especially in English poetry, which is not rhymed and sometimes more rhythmic, what is poetry and what is not? Is it a certain different feeling for you, which tells you this is a piece of poetry, or I'm going to write a piece of poetry, but not a piece of rhythmic prose or whatever?
Well, the first answer to the first bit is a lot of contemporary poetry does rhyme. A lot of the best poets do some poetry rhyming, some not. We often move between it. So I sort of, one book and 2 books ago I was using a lot of full rhyme. My last book has no rhyme in it, or no end rhyme, but it's got a lot of rhyme in the lines. And the free verse, provided it's written by somebody who's any good, is usually actually more technically complicated than strict form, because all sorts of things are going, because the niceties of judgment about what makes the rhythmic kind of sort of bow and rise up again of a line break, or how you make the sounds chime together, primarily through assonance, primarily through the vowels kind of clustering. It's not legislated for, so you have to use entirely your own judgment, not your own judgment plus the rules, but entirely your own judgment. You know, are you using speech rhythms? Are you using, you know, what part of your ear are you using, as it were? And the other thing is that an awful lot of free verse is not actually free verse. Actually, it's either syllabic or, for example, you know, sometimes, you know, I have not, in my new book, a lot of people say it's free verse. There's not a single poem that's free verse. It's all regular numbers of stresses to lines. You know, there's a lot of invention of new forms, which is itself a discipline. So there's all of that going on. If something is completely lacking in discipline, it's kind of by definition not a poem. So that's
how do they come to you? Because it's a lot of Russian poets who wrote about poetry, that it's a certain communication with some other forces who just tell you more or less you're not have your free will, actually, or at least we know it through the Russian poetry. It's beginning from Pushkin. It's probably very romantic tradition. It's this prophetic role, and actually his old body is took apart, and put him new tanga and new everything, a new soul, to go and speak with the people. Is it a certain feeling which every poet do have, that I'm not speaking for myself, but I'm dictated?
Yes and no. I mean, we don't have a prophetic tradition, really. I mean, apart from Blake, and then sort of some of the North Americans who frankly have more space, more room for manoeuvre. In Britain, we don't have a prophetic tradition really in poetry. We just, our language is much more is much quieter than that. English is not a very declamatory language. It's a language of nuance and register because it's a language of synonym. It's a language of multiple roots. So almost everything that we say, as you all know, I mean in conversation too, it's not what we say, it's the way we say it. You know, we can say the same thing and we're being very rude or being very polite, and it's not, I mean that's sometimes just in our intonation too, but synonym is all, and register is all. So but there is something, once you've got plenty of technique, once you really have a technique sort of in your bones, which is to do with not pushing it, which is to do with patience, with letting it come to you to some extent. But it's more like, you know, the clay on a potter's wheel. You put the clay on the wheel. The wheel is a thing that turns, that you've kind of elected to use, and it grows, and you just kind of got to keep it steady, so to speak. And a poem or writing can be like that, and a lot of good poets do talk about it being like that. But it's not automatic writing. I mean, unless you're an interwar surrealist, which by definition none of us are nowadays. Yeah.
You haven't talked very much about language.
No.
Or it seems to me you haven't.
Well.
But actually, but you just mentioned it just now in answer to those questions. I mean, it seems to me that, I mean, the way I think of poetry is that it's that form of discourse or whatever, through which or with which we push at the very edges of what language is and what language can do and what language enables. But I'm wondering now, because of your answer to the very last question, whether actually is that a particularly English understanding of poetry? Because I'm a native English speaker, that's my language, and if I know a language that has this quiet, multi-layered subtlety built into it because of its history.
Yeah.
Is that a particularly English conception of poetry, or is there something there that's more generally true?
I think you're right that stretching language is still part of poetry in general, because I think stretching what can be said is always part of poetry in every culture and time. And so in order to say the very limits of what can be said, you tend to have to use language in at least unfamiliar ways, and often then ways which are kind of fairly transparently stretching it, like unusual vocabulary or unusual constructions and so on. You know, words slip, slide, decay with imprecision, will not stay in place, will not stay still, as Eliot said. I mean, you know, language I think is always, you know, mutable and unreliable. I mean, because it's language, it's not the material world, and it's not the moment of experience. It's itself. It's another astonishing thing that's in the world alongside the other astonishing things in the world. But I think you're right that we have particular local concerns. And I think it's very interesting that North American poetry at the moment, to generalise vastly, is really anxious to avoid any accusation of authenticity. And, you know, sometimes it calls that postmodern, but it's not postmodern. I mean, there's postmodern work and there's not postmodern work, but even the stuff that, you know, knows that it's not postmodern, it's very... And that has to do with register and diction. But of course those are inseparable from what you then say. You know, that kind of, it could be said that I am perhaps having the experience of is, you know, it's a trick of thought, it's also a trick of language. That answer your question? Do you want to?
Okay.
You don't feel you have to.
No, so I'm actually getting a prompt because of the question, Chinese, your experience with Chinese translation and fixed meaning, I thought. you might.
But actually, embarrassingly, I don't know what you're going to say. Would you like to tell me about my experience? Ask about my experience with Chinese translation.
Certainly. Sorry, I'm the husband who's commenting. Just sorry, you were talking about language.
Yeah.
That English has an ambiguity built into it, and Fiona, I believe, experienced when she was in China very fixed meanings of language, where the poetry and seeing wasn't necessarily about the ambiguity of language. It was about, you would see something and it had a meaning that was given.
Okay, yes.
It was unambiguous.
She'll take it from here, I think.
It wasn't really so much about poetry, but that sense that over and over the aspects of the culture we were presented with as a group of international poets was, there is a correct thing to see from this view. I'm not kind of crudely paraphrasing. There is. This is what you see here in this view. You can't interpret it. There's no space for. Of course, one can, but that isn't. But you shouldn't. Yes, as a mark of respect, you shouldn't. Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
You can also read about that in a previous New Humanist.
You can indeed. Yes, that's true. Yes. I thought what Peter was going to say actually was that at this festival they took us around a lake. There were maybe 6 Western poets and 12 Chinese, very good Chinese poets, and where a lot of community groups were reciting poems to us. And it was Festival of Spring, and it's a tradition obviously to wear masks, and everyone who was taking part had been, and there were hundreds of people, had been issued with a mask, and the masks were our faces. There wasn't anything more uncanny than 24 Fiona's faces. I still have dreams about it.
Terrifying.
Yes, yes, it was. Luckily they weren't very good. Shall I read a couple of poems before we break?
Yes, please.
Of course, it's really terrible to talk about the nature of poetry before you read your own poems. Poetry can do all of this, but on the other hand, I'll read you the answering poem to the Shakespeare sonnet, Drowned Man. I didn't write a sonnet because it seemed to me extraordinary hubris to write a sonnet in response to a Shakespeare sonnet. I mean, it's hubris to write a poem in response to a Shakespeare sonnet, but it was a commission and we were paid, so. So it was the holds her in chase was the phrase, the baby holding the mother in chase, just trying to hang on to her skirts. So this has an epigraph, holds him in chase. Drowned man. See how they sleep. First he turns away, and then she turns after him. Or now she turns her back, and he follows. Rolled by an imperative deeper than sleep, he rolls over like a wave that turns itself over sleepily with the sea's deep breathing with its rhythm, pulsing far out from land, pulsing far down in the dark, where creatures not yet formed are forming, where like half-made beasts his dreams swim among hers, where she hears his breathing far above her, nearer to the light, nearer to the white-topped waves, the white-peaked sheets, his arm thrown across her now as she floats upward, drawing him out of deep tides, crossing their legs once more, and morning lies motionless to the horizon. We were talking about Serbia earlier, and for once I don't have any Serbian poems or Macedonian poems, but here's a Slovenian poem. And it's called Dante's Cave because, the original karst region from which all the other limestone karst regions in the world get their names, the Krst in the left, western Slovenia, above Trieste. And they have great big limestone caves, and their story is that when Dante was in exile, he came and saw these caves, and that gave him the idea of the Divine Comedy. But the joke that my husband is willing me to say is that I think that Dante would probably have written a Divine Comedy even if he didn't go to Sydney. Anyway, it's Dante's Cave and it's Velica, Dolin and Scotcham. Finally, I came to the end of the world, to a limestone cliff falling in pale steps, and far below a pool somehow out of myth, proving that there was nothing but the rock to hold me up, to raise me into that clear air where crows were looping, where the eye of God was gold and inattentive. Then I saw the end is air and falling. It is clean and lovely. It is blue. And I'll just read you a couple more. I'll read you I've got to read you a dog poem because Zoe. We have two dogs, and Zoe is a rescue dog from Greece, which is why she's called Zoe, and why this poem has an epigraph from Sappho, which is evening star, bringing back everything the bright dawn scattered. Zoe. Perfectly at home, street dog the colour of coffee, you forget yourself leaning on me. Young dog, the colour of Greek coffee, you lean on me like a child wanting to be picked up, wanting a home in my lap, wanting my coffee. Maybe you want me. Perfect in every part, pricked and appointed ears and nose and tail, you danced your courtship dance on the bare earth, and now, tired child, you come for rest and comfort, asking without shame, because there is no shame, as once Sappho taught you. And if you knew how maddening she is, what a generous poem that is. And I'll finish with The Avenue, because it's about, well, it's poetic ambiguity. The Avenue. You wake and find yourself dreaming you walk an avenue of trees whose canopies stir with the vagueness of dream. It seems as though the time to come must be a wind stirring the leaves, coming from far away in the west, where a coast shimmers vaguely with surf, shimmering like leaves. Their white froth spends itself unimportantly. All this is very far away, and you are very small. The air is deep, and you are far down in its valley, walking the pale dust path, walking against the wind. Time to